So we'll begin by talking about the first couple of chapters of Luke, where he tells a distinctive story of the birth of Jesus and his early days. The stories begin with John the Baptist, actually, and the announcement of his birth, which is paralleled with an announcement of the birth of Jesus, and then reactions to those announcements, including a magnificent bit of poetry put on the lips of Mary, the mother of Jesus, the poem known as the Magnificat. And Zechariah, the father of John, has a similar balancing poem, the Benedictus, and both of them articulate some themes that are very prominent in the gospel as a whole. Are there things, David, that strike you as particularly significant about those?
Well, one picture we've had of Luke's gospel and of the book of Acts is what one says of the Christians somewhere in the book of Acts, that in them the world is turned upside down. And one of the things I noticed most powerfully, especially in Mary's song in the Magnificat, is that the mighty are cast from their thrones and that the lowly are lifted up. And the sense that what happens in Jesus Christ, as foretold in this part of Luke's gospel, is not simply the individual salvation of each human being, though I think that's important, but a reordering of the social structures, a reordering of history. My puzzle is, how does Luke see that happening? Well, that's my first puzzle. How do you think Luke sees that happen? Then I want to think about how we apply that to our times today. How does the world get turned upside down in this country?
That's a really interesting question. The language seems very political, doesn't it?
It does, extremely.
And he has brought down the powerful from their thrones, and he has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich empty away. According to the promises that he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and his descendants forever. It's interesting that Luke concludes on that theme, that there's continuity here.
Huge.
Between God's actions of old in ancient Israel and what's going on in his own environment. There's continuity, but there's also discontinuity, and I think we'll discover that as we get into it. The continuity, I think, is highlighted by the very form of this poem, which seems to be a replication, or inspired by, perhaps, the poem of Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel. And it's interesting to compare the similarities and the differences. That poem that appears in 1 Samuel chapter 2 has some of the same notions of reversal, and God taking the part of the poor and the lonely and the oppressed. And I think that's an important emphasis of Luke, all right. But this emphasis of the larger context of a set of promises going back to Abraham is something that's distinctive of Luke, as is the theme of God's mercy being shown from generation to generation, which we get in Luke 1:50 as part of the Magnificat. That theme of mercy is very distinctive of Luke, and it ties into his insistence that the gospel is really about compassion and forgiveness. So there are two things that happen in this, or two or three things that happen in this hymn. First of all, the notion that there's a parallel, there's continuity. God is working in a similar fashion, but he's doing something new at the same time.
One of the puzzles for me, and I found it unanswerable, so I'm going to put it to you, insofar as we can make guesses about Luke's original audience, is he writing to the oppressed to encourage them, or is he writing to the oppressors to call them to be merciful? Is this written for the comfortable or for the uncomfortable, or both?
Is it to comfort the afflicted?
Yeah,
or
to afflict the comfortable, exactly.
I kind of have the sense that he's writing to afflict the comfortable.
Okay.
There's a message of hope in Luke's gospel as a whole that I think the afflicted can hear, but I think he's really addressing an audience that probably is a little more established, a little more part of the Greco-Roman social order. The very fact that he's writing the literature that he does with these literary prefaces that remind us of the works of the ancient historians, of Herodotus or Thucydides, suggests that he's writing for a literate audience. And the fact that he keeps dwelling on this issue of wealth and poverty suggests that he's writing for people who have some means. They're probably not at the uppermost layer of Roman society. I don't think he's writing for the imperial family or the Roman senatorial class, but I think he's writing for well-to-do urban Christians who are beginning to think about what their responsibilities are in the light of God's transforming message.
So when passages we'll get to, like the Rich Man and Lazarus outside the gate, is written more to help the rich man think about it, to help those of us who are relatively wealthy think about how we're to deal with the impoverished, rather than the impoverished think about how to protest the rich.
So I think that the hymn here, and this is an interesting issue, the hymn has these elements that suggest a notion radical revolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that has been picked up in some contemporary, that is 20th century liberation
Hugely,
theology,
yeah.
in situations where that message probably needs to be heard.
Yeah.
In places like Latin America, for instance. Which shows something about the flexibility of the Bible. The Bible can be applied in various different circumstances, depending on what those circumstances are. But I think Luke, who might have a bit of poetry here that comes out of a situation in ancient Israel where precisely that need for a message of hope to the oppressed was being articulated, applies it to his early Christian audience. And the emphasis here is going to be on the responsible use of wealth, and the way in which this proclamation of God's option for the poor has to be heard by and acted upon by people who are in a position to do so.
And that ties in with the kind of sense of church community we get in the book of Acts, where they're not the wealthiest, but on the other hand, it does include people of some wealth, and it does include questions of responsibility for the least among them.
That's right.
Which I think is also very important.
Yeah, and you get this ambiguity, just to refer to Acts again. I think as we go through Luke, we'll constantly be looking at some parallels in Acts. Acts begins with this image of the early Christian community sharing their goods.
Yep.
Almost a kind of early Christian communism.
Yep.
But that then
Small c.
Small c,
Yeah,
yes. But that then seems to evaporate as things move along, and the community seems to be more like what we understand it to have been by the end of the first century, when this gospel was probably written.
Yeah. But I think I want to underline what you also said, that one of the gifts of Scripture is that different people in different social locations can find in it the promise that they need. And were I an oppressed and marginalized person, I think I'd love the Magnificat for the opposite reason, that it would bring me hope that those like you and I, like you and me, sitting here in comfort, may one day have to be relativized for the sake of those who have so much less.
There is a challenge here for those.
There is a challenge here,
That's right,
on both sides.
And we'll hear some of that prophetic challenge in other parts of Luke, particularly the Sermon on the Plain.
Yeah.
One other dimension of the poem here that I want to call attention to is the person who says it. That is Mary, the mother of Jesus. What do you think about the role of women in the third gospel?
I think there is no question that at key points, especially at the beginning and the end, we have women as those who bear testimony. I wrote one time in an article for which I got enormous trouble that I thought in this gospel Mary was the first Christian preacher, because she actually preaches the gospel, sings the gospel. Maybe she's the first Christian anthem singer. But the anthem is proclamation, it's gospel, and I think that's an important theme. I got in trouble because people thought I was making her a Christian when she was really a Jew, and that it was an anti-Semitic claim. I was merely saying I think that she presents the gospel. I think that's very important, and we'll see women as those who bear testimony and receive mercy time after time after time in this gospel.
Luke is very much interested in women. Do you think he was a defender of, let's say, women's rights to be leaders of Christian communities? Or?
I think he knew that women were leaders of Christian communities and didn't seem to have any problem with it. So I think in that sense, whether he was making a case or just assuming a case, I don't know. But I think I don't find him saying, "Oh, be quiet, you're just a woman," or having the apostles say that or Jesus say that. So I think he's for the kind of community where leadership is shared. What do you think?
I think he, again, like yourself, he knows of those Christian communities. I think he grows out of a kind of Pauline Christianity. And some of the egalitarian attitudes that we see in Paul's letters, neither male nor female in Christ. People like Junia, foremost among the apostles, are there in the background of Luke.
I think so too.
But again, I have just a little bit of a suspicion that Luke is moving on toward the kind of Christianity that we see in other parts of the New Testament, where women have to be in their place. And that they're understood to be significant parts of the community, but are they really in leadership?
Par,
that's right.
Equal,
there's an ambivalence there.
There is an ambivalence there.
It's somewhat similar, I think, to the kind of ambivalence you see about issues of wealth and poverty. That Luke really has an important thing to say about the responsibility of those in positions of wealth and position to do something about. But at the same time, they can keep their money.
We'll see more of that. But my great story on this, and then I want to get to the rest of the birth narrative, was years ago when I was teaching a course on preaching from Luke, and there was a woman in the class who was from Ghana, and both those things are important. She's a woman and she's from Ghana, and she read this, however we might read this, as if she had found her voice, that Ghanaian Christians had not had women leaders, that they had raised money to send her to seminary, and Mary was her cry, that her soul magnified the Lord because, like Mary, she was able to proclaim the gospel. So I can never hear it without hearing that at the same time. Yeah, as being powerful. All right, let's move to the most famous part of Luke's gospel, except perhaps for the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, the birth narratives. And in churches where I've been a pastor, every year, about 2 Sundays before Christmas, we have this retelling of the Christmas story where the shepherds hear the angel, and then the wise men show up, and we have the presenting of the gifts, and then they all stand and take a bow together. But interestingly, in Luke 2, no wise men, no star, just these shepherds and a manger and a voice that says, "This is a sign to you." What's the sign? Why does Luke tell this interesting story?
I think an important part of the symbolism here is the fact that it's shepherds who are bringing their gifts and acknowledging the sovereignty of Jesus. And this is of a piece with the theme that we had both in the Magnificat and the Benedictus, that God is being faithful to his promises of old. Those promises were promises to Abraham. Here I think you evoke David, the great shepherd of ancient Israel. And I think Luke knows and understands that one of the expectations in first century Judaism was that there would be a Davidic Messiah, and I think he's insinuating that Jesus is the fulfillment of those hopes. And he does so indirectly here because he has some issues with that, I think, and we'll see them later. It's not the dominant way in which he understands Jesus, but he wants to say, yes, this too is something that we can affirm about Jesus. And also, of course, it's that people who are lowly and marginalized are recognizing this king.
Right.
It's not the magi, whoever they are, wise people or kings from the East. They're the least and the least respected among Israel's societies.
And I think, too, relative to what we have seen and will continue to see, that while everything is called into question by Jesus' coming, not everything is turned upside down. It's always struck me that instead of simply wandering off to proclaim the gospel everywhere, they return to their sheep. They return to their sheep glorifying and praising God. And I sometimes think Luke's vision of what happens in Jesus Christ is not that tax collectors necessarily stop collecting taxes, or that teachers stop teaching, or that rulers stop ruling, but they do it to the glory and praise of God. And that shifts the context without necessarily shifting the job description.
Right. There is an important theme of reversal, but how that reversal
works may not be everybody get into sackcloth and ashes and head out. Right.
Good.
Thank you.